I'm assuming the sign-up that Dave has given us for the greeters is making its way around. Again, that's an important thing that we do, is make people feel welcome here right from the get-go. So thank you for that. Our meal preparers and sitters upper here this morning was Todd Ball and John Kennedy and Ralph Hardy. So let's give them a round of applause. We were concerned this morning because about 9 of our guys, many of whom are regulars on Saturday mornings, are on the mission trip. And so they're on their way back from North Carolina this morning, and a couple of our regular cooks are part of that. But we were actually prepared early. So as Todd said, we have identified a bottleneck in our production. We're going to communicate that to Hank Sneed and Kelly Henderson, all right? No, we're not. No, we're not. But Hank took that so seriously, he called Todd several times to make sure he was going to be here, and especially to make the gravy, because you guys are ornery when we don't have the gravy. So I know you enjoyed that this morning. We're in the midst of our stewardship emphasis, 2020 vision, generosity, legacy of generosity. We lost, if you were here last Sunday for All Saints Day, we lost 23 of our brothers and sisters last year. And you know, I told Jenny we really took a body blow last year at Central. We lost some dear people. And that means dear in terms of who they are to us and who they have been over decades and decades. But when you lose people who are regular in their worship, who are generous in their giving and their participation in the life of the church, 23. Okay? And so when I talk about a legacy, they've bequeathed that to us, and it's our turn now to step up and to show our own generosity. So please, next Sunday is going to be our invitation to make our estimates of giving for next year. We hope to have an 8% increase this year so that we can increase our outreach and restore some things that we had to trim last year because of a dip, and also to do some new ministries. So please keep that in mind as you prayerfully consider your gift. Also, 2 weeks from today, from 9 to noon, we're having something called the Advent Experience. It's part of our Psalms emphasis this year. There will be something for all ages. Advent starts really early this year, December 1, which is the Sunday after Thanksgiving. So it's like it's right in front of us. But on the 23rd, we've had a team working on this for a couple of months, and they're bringing in some outside people to be a part of this, to get us oriented spiritually, biblically, some things that we can, some of the families with children can make with their hands to take home with them, an Advent wreath. And I encourage you to be present, to support your own spiritual journey through Advent, and to honor those that have been preparing this so diligently. Our speaker today, Dr. Scott Pierce, was born in Maryville, Missouri. He even put the dates in here, so I'm going to say it. He graduated from Maryville High School in 1973, received his BS in Animal Sciences at Northwest Missouri State University in 1977. Attended the University of Missouri, the College of Veterinary Medicine in Columbia. Received his doctorate of veterinary medicine in 1983. His own father was a veterinarian, and Scott followed in his footsteps, except that Scott has decided throughout his vocation to specialize in horses. He's at Rood and Riddle now, of course, one of the premier veterinary hospitals in our area. After practicing in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and Lee Summit, Missouri, which is outside of Kansas City, Scott met Bill Rood at a meeting, and on he's gone from there. Scott was baptized in Maryville's First Christian Church, Disciples in Christ. His parents were members there. He joined Central in 2014. It's been 5 years, Doc? My goodness, 5 years now. Scott's wife, Debbie, is an equine veterinarian as well. They have 2 children, Vivian and Audra, and they are delightful. They're regular participants at the 8:30 worship service. Scott's also the proud father of 4 other children, Stephanie and Jennifer and Riley and Rhett, 2 of whom, guess what, are also veterinarians. And he has 2 grandchildren, Savannah and Shane. Scott's very involved in all the areas at Central Christian. He's a Stephen minister, actively reaching out and providing that kind of compassionate care and confidential care to members of our congregation. And he's just a downright good man. He's the president or the chair of the board of our Central Music Academy that had a tremendous fundraiser last weekend that raised $40,000. Scott, did I hear? Congratulations. Please welcome Dr. Scott Pierce.
All right, cheat notes here. I can't do this one alone here. Thank you for the invitation to speak, and thank you for the introduction. Thank you for this Psalms event that we have, and I've found 138. And in there, on the day I called, you answered me. You increased my strength of soul. Okay. I've got allergies too, so if I start sniffling a little bit, it's not emotional, okay? All right. Okay, I've given work-related talks all over the world, and on my topic of equine, mostly respiratory issues. And I'd have to say this one's the most challenging. I've always had an equine topic to discuss, and this personal journey is a little, as many of you know, is a little more difficult and is obviously new to me, so bear with me a little bit. It's really been amazing to prepare for this talk, as it's like David knew my script, because he addressed many of my thoughts in his sermons. It was really unbelievable. But I'll try to stay on script because he said I had like 20 minutes. Like others, when David asked me to speak, he texted me, he texted me and said, "Would you speak at a men's? And I want you to kick it off the year." And I was busy, I had to come, so I said I could do November. He go, and I said, no, why? I said to myself, why me? I go, come on. And I go, it was interesting to hear Tim talk last month because he hit on this not worthy issue. And that was my thought. And I texted him back and I said, David, I'm not worthy of that, really. And he goes, and he texted me back like my father would. He said, I'm sure you'll be all right. Okay, I go. But really, let me explain first, though, the reasoning behind my thoughts there. I've sat here and listened to I've only missed a couple of these men's breakfasts because I've been out of town, but you hear stories from Wayne to Hank to Josh to all these guys that have had major stories, and they've discussed their past struggles and issues as well, but discussed our winters of the heart. And so I want David to know that I do listen. Wow. But a fairly common theme, which I quite frankly envied, was that most had a life of faith. Most had service to God and participation in church. And quite honestly, that hasn't been my story. So I thought about it and then realized that everyone's journey is different. Not everyone has been in step with Jesus. So I agree. Okay, a little background, and I suppose somewhat of a disclaimer that in my late 20s I joined an equine practice where I was essentially the third veterinarian after Bill Root and Tom Riddle. This was the beginning of a long and a successful 35-year work venture. And it's grown basically into probably the biggest referral practice in the world. Now we, as the third veterinarian, now we have over 80. So you get an idea of what's going on. And I'm not boasting there. I'm really, trying to explain the rationale or the reasoning or the excuse behind many of my personal sacrifices. I continually ask myself the what ifs. Everybody who does that, the what ifs. This was a choice I made, putting work before everything else, and I look back and I try to mentor young vets, and I try to counsel them on the mistakes I made and the choices they can make. I continually ask myself the what ifs. What if I'd have done this? What if I'd have done that? Would the business be where it is? Would I have the time to take off now that I do? Would I have 2 young, great children? For that matter, would I be standing here? This leads me to question number 1. I'll try to stay on script, that the old scenario, the nut doesn't fall too far from the tree. I idolized my father. But also another man to be named later. Dad was a veterinarian practicing in rural Missouri, Maryville, Missouri. He practiced there 47 years. He was cut from the James Harriet cloth, so you know what I'm talking about there. He cared for all animals, but particularly loved his cattle practice. I can remember as early as 5 years old, remembering riding with my father on farm calls. He worked so hard, that was the way I spent time with him, because he was always working. He was a solo practitioner and had no backup, so he practiced by himself. So he was basically, essentially, on call all the time, so he was a worker. This was the case most of my young life. He was also a very, very good golfer. It was amazing. He could take the whole winter off and pick a club up in April and May and shoot a 72. I mean, he was scratch golfing. So he played in a lot of the state, when he wasn't working, he was golfing. So he played in a lot of state amateurs, and what I do, I wanted to be with him. I was his caddy. So I went all over the states, basically, with him caddying. That explains why I'm no good at golf, because I caddied all the time, and he should have. And plus, I was left-handed, and he made me swing right-handed. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. My dad never showed much emotion. He was kind of from that area, and I think I know why. But you know, I don't remember hugs. I don't remember a simple "I love you," but there was no doubt that in my mind that he loved me. I also saw other things. I saw how the community looked up to him and respected him. He was a pillar of that small town. Such a good, decent man with a sense of humor. I was telling one of my older kids the other day, and this is true. The only bad word I ever heard Grandpa say was Sam Hell. What the Sam Hell is this or that? And for the longest time, I wondered what Sam Hell was. But I always knew it was a real bad word, because my grandpa said that too. So I said, to this day, I'm not sure where that comes from. But anyway, it was a bad word. That was the only bad word I ever heard my dad say. I wish I could say the same. That whole generation was so humble, thrifty, mostly quiet, and modest, and hardworking, obviously knowing the perils of the Great Depression. My dad was no exception here. I'm genuinely concerned about the future of this country and our loss of humility. I actually pray for this country to find more humility. Not only with our leaders, but with our children. And the children are the ones that count, because they're our future. And I wish more kids could travel as I have around the world, and they see these other countries and how fortunate we really have things. Mom, as David said, Mom and Dad were members of the First Christian Church in Maryville, the church I was baptized in. I must say that, you know, we were the EC Christians. If you're Lutheran, I think it's ETC Christians. Like my wife, you get that from my wife. My wife, you know, we've been married not quite 20 years. And her parents are Lutheran, and they've accused me of being an ETC Christian. But not now, it used to be. Let's see.
What's the T stand for, Scott?
Thanksgiving.
Oh, Easter, Thanksgiving, Christmas. Okay.
Yeah. My dad practiced 47 years there and moved to Kentucky after he retired, and they joined the church in the Disciples Church in Lawrenceburg. That's where they converted from the EC to regular, active church participants, becoming elders, Dad singing in the choir. And in fact, Dad, I like to think that my parents got in step with Jesus during that time. Better late than never. Quite honestly, I didn't want that to be the case with me, waiting until the twilight of my life to get closer to God. Okay, back to question number 1. My dad was in the Navy on the USS Zane, and this might explain some of the reason the way he is. He was on a minesweeper in the Pacific in World War II. And this was pretty stressful, I'd say. He lost both of his parents the same year when he was 18. He was on the ship, and he couldn't come back for either funeral. He was in the middle of the war. He served 2 years and returned to Missouri with no support or family unit. He was an only child. That's where idol number 2 comes in. Lee Burns and Grace, his wife Grace, took Dad in as he was a friend with their son Billy through school, who basically became my uncle. And Dad had gone to school with Billy. They became my grandparents on my father's side. My mother's side, they lived in Hot Spring, or Little Rock, Arkansas, so I rarely saw my grandfather on my mother's side. My grandfather was salt of the earth, a farmer, simple, honest, hardworking, and religious. I essentially spent every summer living with them as much as I could from ages 5 to 15. They worked hard from dawn to dusk. They were church-going people and probably the best Christians I've ever known. Every Sunday, we would go to a small non-denominational church called Bethany, and I showed you some pictures of that small, beautiful church. Usually around 25, 30 people were there in attendance. Maybe on EC days, 40. My grandmother was an organist, so you know where this goes. My older brother and I, duets. He's got the whole world in his hands, etc. In front of the entire congregation. I was mortified, 5, 6, 7 years old. I mean, I was mortified, but it was a good experience. And really, probably my time there was, thinking back and not realizing it, but that's probably why I like the early service, because it reminds me of that. These were some of the best years of my life and the first real exposure to regular participation in a church. My grandparents not only talked the Christian talk, but they walked the walk. Okay, I recently went to a Christian veterinary mission retreat that really put some perspective on my life. I listened to a presentation by a Reverend PhD, Reverend Patrick Lai, whose life's mission is to provide jobs for people in third world countries. I sat there wishing I had heard him years ago. He has opened numerous businesses in these third world countries, Indonesia, etc., for the past 20 years. He described how basic and important work has been throughout history. He discussed the importance of work and how it even related to the Bible, including many of Jesus' parables. The work is mentioned during that time. And even in Genesis, in the beginning there, he said, multiply and work, labor, work the land. He said profit, business, money, and work were not as secular as we have been led to believe, and it's how we choose to use the money and business that really counts. He defined it as workship. Dr. Lai went on to talk about how we are taught, not only you preachers, and a lot of preachers out there, but anybody in general, how we're taught to sow the seeds. But we really need to, and they weren't taught, he wasn't taught as a preacher, and we're not taught as people and humans how to plow before we sow the seeds. And what he meant by that, to work the earth before planting, and in this case is to learn to love and pray. His words really struck me as work has been such a big part of my life. Okay, as life goes on, working as my idols and mentors did, I wondered how they kept the balance. I don't know. My life was not the case, as my balance was all work, causing numerous sacrifices, including marriage, burnout, and relationships with my older kids. Looking back, I'm amazed that something bad didn't happen to me. And today I'm so thankful that I have a great relationship with my adult children. I remember going on a partners retreat, a regional partners retreat with the original guys, the original 5 or 6 partners. And we did a round robin there, and we all reflected. This was after the thing was launched, and there was just 5 or 6, that's 6 of us. We went around the table, and it was a very emotional time because everyone was talking about the sacrifices they'd made to get it to where it was. Sometimes the thrill of my business, and everybody looks on TV, go to Keno, see all these multi-million-dollar horses sell. A lot of times the thrill of the business is watching some of the top horses in the world that I've worked on, bring millions of dollars, like one out here brought $8 million the other day. And so it's crazy. Early on, it was amazing to see somebody pay $8 million for a horse, and it was exciting to witness. But as you reflect and you age and your perspective and things change, you sit there and you start thinking, man, what could I do with $8 million? You know, I'd give it away. What good could we do with $8 million? And here you're spending on a 4-year creature, which it's awesome because those guys pay the bills good, but that's a lot of money for a 4-legged creature. I only hope that these super will, and I work for billionaires, that there was a guy the other day that his agent, he said, we were looking at horses, and one of the agents that a coworker of mine, he goes, what would you do if you had this $3 billion? And I go, $3 billion? And I said, I'd give it away. And he looked at me like I had 2 heads. He goes, in fact, it disturbed him so much, he called me the next day. What would you give it? I said, yeah, what, are you kidding me? Just think what we could do with that. But anyway, I do know that some of these wealthy people are very generous. God works in mysterious ways. $3 billion, I mean, just think about how much money that is. I always look, like I said, I always look back in the what ifs. You know, I'm now happily married and have 2 awesome young girls that honestly I can't imagine life without. As one ages, one starts to appreciate the nut falling from the tree scenario. It becomes very apparent that shaping and mentoring kids and leading by example is probably the most important thing we can do. All my children don't necessarily talk the talk, but they're good people and they do walk the walk. This nut makes sure they get hugs and they're told they are loved. One thing that bothered me about my father the last 20 years was his continual discussion and worrying of dying. It really bothered me, you know, the last 20 years of his life. It was his problem, his difficulty in departing in peace, as you discussed last week. And to the day he died, he had trouble departing in peace. I said to myself that I didn't want to go around and be that way as I aged. So between that and facing too many premature deaths, and my brother didn't make it to 50 as he died of cancer, those became my wake-up calls. I had a lot of good friends, some killed by horses, cancer, AIDS, etc. I mean, just died early in their 30s, in 40s. So years ago, and this was one of the latest, a very good friend of mine, years ago, a good friend of mine, I had to go to Florida to see him. He was lying on bed dying of cancer, and he was a young man. And I was just there, I had to go to Saratoga to a horse sale, so I was there about, I don't know, it was around a week, maybe 5 days before he died. He was just shattered, he was skinny, his legs were, I mean, he was just emaciated from cancer. And I've never forgotten the last thing he said to me. He whispered, and David calls me Doc, and the original Doc's my dad, but they call me, everybody in the business calls me Doc too. That's because they can't remember Scott, but anyway. And there's 300 vets in this town, and they'll say Doc, and about 6 people turn around. Okay, so this guy, I don't want to say his name, whispered and said, Doc, come here, I need to tell you something. He couldn't hardly do so, he whispered almost because he was so weak. And I thought, at the time, man, he's going to say something profound. But he goes, I go, what? He goes, I need to get out of here and spend some of my money. And I go, I was speechless. You know, because he was one of these tight guys who beat you out of a quarter and $2 and whatever, and he was tight. And that really hit home. I've never forgotten that. And I always tell people who are worried about money, a little greedy or tight, that I've yet to see a Brinks truck behind a hearse. Okay, also having an intense interest in history. I love history, and that was my major before I converted back to veterinary medicine. But I've read biographies from Caesar to Reagan and everything in between. I love it. But they all had one thing in common as a historian, like an amateur historian. All these biographies, they all died. So I'm thinking, they all died. So, I mean, from Caesar to all these guys died. So, you know, it makes you think, well, you're dying too. Everybody else is dying. Some very important people. So trained in science, and Jim can relate to this. It was difficult for me to grasp faith as you know, you always needed proof, you needed evidence. It's tough. And I admired the professionals whom were spirit, and to this day, that's many of my colleagues are that way. I admired many other professionals who were spiritual, and I really wondered what made them tick. I began to read the Bible during my journey here the last quite a few years. But I read the Bible, and it's a very tough read for me. I know you guys can probably breeze through it, but thank God for Jerry's class. And I thought, thanks to David and Jerry for helping me understand and interpret many things, many bad things in the Old Testament. And through what David called his Jesus filter, that made an impression with me and helped. Many books summarizing the various chapters of the Bible were helpful. That just kind of dumbed it down for yours truly. Books like years ago in the late 80s, A Case for Christ, where that was an interesting read, written in the late 80s, where this atheist guy his wife converted, and he was an atheist. He tried to prove her wrong, so he went on a journey to prove her wrong. And in the meantime, he proved to himself that Christ was the Son of God, and converted to a Baptist minister. But that was a pretty cool read. Even O'Reilly's book, Bill O'Reilly's Killing Jesus, that was interesting. And then read, and I can't wait for David Royce's and Jerry's class giving a couple topics on near-death experience. But I read a lot of books on NDEs, near-death experiences. They were very compelling, and the take-home message from those was every one of those, no matter where they were in the world and what they reported, the bottom line was love and how to coming out of those. That was pretty interesting. My journey is by no means complete, and I'm not sure what God's plans are for me. But my faith in God is firm, and my walk with Christ is on its way. Okay, question number 2. We'll get out of here. Divorced with kids, 20 plus years ago, burned out. You know, I could have, okay, tell us about a particularly difficult period of your life, and how did faith strengthen you? Okay, that's the question. Divorced with kids, 20 plus years ago, burned out, you know, really a bad winter of my life. You know, I could have and should have leaned on God, but I didn't. I internalized everything and did it alone. David's sermon telling us a couple weeks ago that there's no valor in going it alone couldn't be more true. I could have used a Stephen minister. I could have used anything. Little did I know at the time that God was really there. This is, okay. Then years ago, I was faced with an illness similar to the one that killed my brother. They were saying you got cancer and all this. And they were describing all the stuff they were going to do to me. And I said, whoa, let's stop here a second. This was low. And I said, I'm not liking what I'm hearing here. Let's, of course, who wants to like that? And my brother just died from that year, a few years. He didn't make it to 50. And so I was faced with that, and I said, whoa. So I canceled all my stuff here. And I said, I want another opinion, which I encourage everyone to get second opinions, even with me. And so the nurses were calling me and said, do you realize you probably have cancer? You need to get here. Because I made an appointment at Cleveland Clinic, went up there. And they were the same way. They went through all the stuff. They said they're going to cut this out and do this, and you'll live like this. And, you know, you have blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, we don't know I have this yet. We don't know we have this. They said, you're right. So, but they said, odds are you do. I said, okay. So I'm laying there on the gurney to go into surgery for a biopsy, and they, you know, talk to God then. I knew I'd have trouble with this. He said, get me through this, and I'll serve. Okay, so the biopsy came back negative. The doctor said I was a very lucky man, and here I am. Okay, I'm constantly working. I knew I'd have trouble with that little paragraph. It was a very emotional time. But I'm his. Okay, I'm constantly looking back for ways I contribute my time, talent, and treasure, as David talks about, and do some of each. Early on, I was impressed with the outreach at Central. I've become involved with Room in the End, Central Music Academy, and Stephen's ministry. Speaking of Stephen ministry, you knew I wouldn't get out of here without a plug in for that. A quick word, I went through 50 hours of training to learn a mission of compassion. I was lucky enough to go through the training with Kim Joyner, who's an awesome person. And currently 2 more men are taking the class right now. We're not preachers by any stretch, but we serve God. And with Jesus' guidance, we are there to share burdens and to listen. The visits are always confidential. And I bring this up now because I could have used the Stephen minister in my life, there's no question. My mother, in battling my brother with mental illness, he was so bad to her. She could have used the Stephen minister. And so what I know now is there's no valor in going alone. Men are especially reluctant to reach out for help because this is an amazing program, and I strongly encourage my fellow members to consider it if they're down and out and need someone to talk to. I recently went on the Central Veterinary Mission Retreat and hope to participate in that. With my talent, I've taken Spanish lessons for the past couple of years and have an interest in going somewhere in Latin America, although there are plenty of needy areas in this country. I pray all the time, asking for direction and asking Him to guide me into the areas He wants me to serve. Question number 3. As you look back on your life, what is the one thing for which you are profoundly grateful to God? How do you name one thing? I mean, what is the one thing? First and foremost, I'm grateful to God for waking me up. I'm grateful for my family, to my wife, Debbie, and for all my children. They are such good kids. I'm grateful that most of my professional life, with a couple obvious exceptions, I've loved my job, and I've always woke up every morning looking forward to going to work. I'm thankful and grateful for my humble childhood. I'm also thankful to Central Christian Church, and I'm not just saying this because I'm speaking today. This is from the heart. I visited many churches before I joined here, and Central has been a perfect fit for me. I thank Bob Cuny before he left, as he was the interim minister before I joined. The friendly, welcoming atmosphere was obvious, along with the open communion, very important to me, and the outreach. And I have to say, John and Brenda Peterson were especially early friends and welcoming. I love the early service. I really didn't think of this before writing this, but it probably reminds me a little Bethany Church. I attended with my grandparents. And I don't know about the others here, but for the first time in my life, there have been numerous Sundays I leave here with like a weight lifted off my shoulders. Okay, in closing, I want to address David, as he's been very open about his professional and personal battles and difficulties. Very similar to many of us. The past summer, we were at the farm, sitting there with my sister, and I was listening to Audra, my 11-year-old, talking to my sister about the church and various topics. I heard her detail and discuss two things David had included in recent sermons. I just sat there and go, wow, this is amazing. How profound was that? And I was just thinking how much amazing influence you've had on the youth and have had for the past 30 years. And I hope that you think of things like this when you struggle to write the next sermon, because this is part of your legacy, my friend. Thank you.
Doc talking about Vivian and Audra, Jim Ritterbush and I, Jim being one of the elders who sponsored some of our youth when we do pastor's class. And I've had the blessing of having both Vivian and Audra in my pastor's class. And they are top notch, I want you to know. So Scott and Debbie have done well there. I want to thank Clay Haney, who's recording all of these things now and is just here and does it, turns it into our communications person. And it's just a blessing to have Clay. So Clay, thank you, brother. Appreciate it. You know, when I hear, again, we can all say this, but as we hear these stories in their diversity and vulnerability and honesty, I was telling Todd and John in the kitchen this morning that when I travel and I talk to some of my colleagues about men's ministry, and many of them don't even have one anymore, just gave up on it, and I talk about what we do, 40 men, second Saturday of the month, the level of sharing that takes place in these stories, and they sort of say, how do you do that? And I think we all know that it was started by Wayne Bell, who set the bar for us in that very first one, September of 2015. And we all said, oh my gosh, we should be taping this. And ever since, we've got every one of them. And they're all on the website, guys, all of them. And I'm looking out, realizing all the stories that have been shared. But you all are willing to step up to the plate, even if you don't feel worthy, quote unquote, to stand in front of us and give that honest sharing. And it's just a powerful thing to hear. We don't meet next month. That's December. We let that go. January, Phil Points is going to be with us. Phil was another one. Oh, you don't want me up there. Yes, we do, Phil. Absolutely. Absolutely we do. I'm glad that Scott put in a word for Stephen Ministers, which is, the Don't Go It Alone and the work that our Stephen Ministers do. In utter confidence, nobody knows, but that kind of ministry that's taking place. Okay, any other words that are good for the cause? We're adjourned. Guys, if you could help bust things back to the back, as always. Take your dirties over here, and everything goes back to the kitchen. Thank you.